Dear reader, I'm Tony and this is Book Text. It's time for another Friday Reads video, but first, our word of the day is the word galoot. It is a noun. It's originally from the early 19th century. It was a slang term referring to a foolish or awkward man. A big galoot. And I think I've heard that maybe less often than other slang words, but I think that word still is used quite a bit in modern times. Kind of fun, but it originates in the early 1800s. So I have done a lot of reading and a lot of book shopping. There is a preview for a later video of my stack of recently purchased books over there. So look forward to that. I read a lot of books this week because I was doing the reading rush, and I actually started mine a few days earlier, and I will extend it a few days after the actual end of reading rush because I wanted to do kind of 2 weeks instead of 1 week of reading as much as I can before the next school year starts. So I'm going to cover what I've finished reading, what I'm currently reading, and then what I'm planning to read next week. So first, I finished my short story book, Isaac Asimov's The Winds of Change and Other Stories. It is a collection of short science fiction, and some stories were obviously better than others, but overall I really enjoyed it and I gave it 4 stars. And I have now moved on to a new short story book that I will mention in my currently reading section. So I enjoyed that one. I am also finished listening to the audiobook In This Grave Hour, which is the 13th book in the Maisie Dobbs mystery series by Jacqueline Winspear. Again, I fell in love with the minor characters. I really enjoy seeing how deeply Winspear develops her minor characters. I felt like the resolution to the mystery kind of came out of nowhere. But I really enjoyed the build up to it, so I gave it 4 stars. Okay, on to my reading rush specific books. I read The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. This is the story of Florence Green, who opens a bookshop in a small town in England in 1959 and experiences immense hostility against having a bookshop and against the location that she chooses and all sorts of things. This was poignant, it was sad, it was super cozy. I wasn't expecting it to be that cozy. I mean, I guess I should have known bookshops make me feel cozy in general. But the building that she has bought for her, or she's renting for her bookshop, has so much character. It even has a poltergeist, so it feels, or a supposed poltergeist, so it feels alive. And it was kind of fun in that way. I wanted to just be in her bookshop all the time, help her out. She has a couple of minor characters that help her. But overall, this was actually a depressing commentary on people's reactions to culture, art, books especially, and the progress that we are making as a race. And so it was very sad, but 5 stars, because I loved it. Then I finished The Shawl by Cynthia Ozick. This is a short story and a novella. They're related. They are about Rosa Lublin, who was a Jewish woman who saw her baby girl die in a concentration camp. And then in the novella, you see Rosa living in Florida in kind of her golden years. But she is still experiencing the lingering effects of grief and the loss of her national identity that came from World War II and being, kind of moved around the world. So it was kind of a chaotic writing style, but I felt like that helped flesh out Rosa's psyche as someone who's experienced so much loss and horrible things. So I liked it. It was sad, for sure. And I think it's overall a great female contribution to Jewish literature. I don't see a lot of that in the books that I read. So I gave this one 4 stars as well. I also finished, most of these I read in one day. So I also finished The Country of the Pointed Firs by Sarah Orne Jewett. This is about a woman who lives for one summer in a small coastal town in Maine in the 1890s, except that it's not actually about this woman. It's not about the narrator. It is about all the different local people that she meets. And I loved that. So the main character, well, if you can call her the main character, the narrator is very bland. She's very nondescript. She has no personality. It's about kind of her meeting and learning about these people and hearing their stories. So I thought the kind of quaintness and coziness of the different people she meets reminded me a lot of the various characters that Anne Shirley meets in the Anne of Green Gables books. So very similar kind of writing, similar story. I wanted to escape into this book and never leave. I am definitely reading more Sarah Orne Jewett in the future. I gave this one 5 stars, as you can imagine. Okay, I also read 84 Charing Cross Road by Helene Hanff. This is a collection of letters sent between Helene herself, who was a freelance writer in New York in the 50s and 60s, and a used bookstore in London at the address of 84 Charing Cross Road. And through the exchange of letters, you get to really meet people, see kind of how they think, how they act, how they live. The characters actually never meet in person, but they develop such a strong bond over the distance. They start to send each other gifts for holidays, and Helene sends food packages to the bookstore because when she learns that England is on rations. They obviously chat about books as she submits her orders over the years. I loved this. What I love about it is that they were all real people as far as I know. So you get kind of the realism, but also the sweetness of the human spirit. I gave this one 5 stars. Really liked it. Okay. I read also this week Green Witch by Alice Hoffman. This is a story that takes place after a horrific disaster. And the teenager who is the main character named Green, she is the only member of her family left alive. She's living alone. She's quite lonely. And she starts to visit the local witches in order to write down the stories of their losses, because everybody lost something or someone in this disaster related to a war. And this ended up being a brilliant kind of magical realism book about bereaved women and how they overcome loss, how they overcome grief, and how they overcome the effects of war. I loved it. It was brief, but it was brilliant. And though it was short, it was not short on content. I think I ended up giving this one 4 stars. Onto a lighter book, I read Portuguese Irregular Verbs by Alexander McCall Smith. This is a series of really funny vignettes about the kind of awkward adventures of Professor Dr. von Edelfeld, who is a German professor, and his one claim to fame is that he wrote a book called Portuguese Irregular Verbs, because he was a linguistics professor. Philology is the term that they use, the love of language and love of words. And so he has this one book that he wrote that he's very proud of, and nobody knows about it because his academic field is really small, and his few colleagues, he gives them the book, and then he also gives the book to people that he meets, people that he likes, and he sneaks around and tries to figure out if they've read the book in some of these vignettes, which I thought was quite funny. He's overall just really awkward, socially awkward. I felt that as an academic person, I felt like his story was quite familiar because I'm on a similar career path, and I sensed that maybe I have some of the same awkward tendencies. I have a published book that I'm quite proud of, but Only a few people have read it. My parents haven't even, they have it on a shelf in their home, but they've never read it. And that, it feels very familiar. So it was funny. It wasn't, very heavy regarding content or, actual weight, but I enjoyed it. And I will continue reading this series. It's the first of a short series of books. So very quick, very funny, and I gave it 4 stars. Last, for the books that I have finished, I read yesterday Lydia Chukovskaya's Sofia Petrovna. This was the story of a middle-aged widow living in Soviet Russia in 1937 when her only son is arrested seemingly at random. And she tries to figure out how to move on beyond that, how to keep living. There is a lot of harsh things that happen in this book. It is a really interesting, because it's a fictional account of something that actually happened to many people. It's an interesting foray into kind of learning about history, about a chaotic era of Russian history. And if I've ever heard a redundant statement, chaotic era in Russian history is one of them. But it's about the Great Purge, where political dissidents and anyone who seems suspicious at any level and their closest relatives were arrested, sent to work in work camps, labor camps, and or deported. And this actually happened. And I've read a couple books that deal with it, but none that actually were set in Russia about a Russian woman. They were about kind of Lithuanian people, Polish people who were also sent out of the country as the Soviet regime kind of rose to power. Interesting, but very bleak, and a really ambiguous ending. It's really interesting. So I gave this one 4 stars. Okay, so those are what I have read. I'm still reading, I'd Rather Be Reading by Anne Bogel. This is a collection of essays, short essays about books. So I'm reading 1 a day. And I'm also reading 1 poem a day from Museum of Distance by Ashley Seitz Kramer. And still enjoying those books. For the short stories, since I finished reading 1 story a day from Isaac Asimov's book, I have since picked up The Best of Richard Matheson by Richard Matheson. It's a collection of his works. He is a horror writer. He wrote I Am Legend. That's probably one of his most famous works. And so he has been, the influence for Stephen King and Neil Gaiman. And he is compared frequently to Asimov and Ray Bradbury, which I have read a lot from both of those, but I've never read anything by Richard Matheson until now. I've read only a couple stories so far, but they were really spooky, very creepy, very good. Kind of, they have that good structure of a short story, a good twist at the end. Cannot read them in the dark, though, because they are actually very scary. But I enjoy that just a little bit. So I am looking forward to continuing with this book. I'm also listening to the audiobook of The Long Way to a Small Angry Planet by Becky Chambers. This is a lighthearted space opera. And I love space operas, but I love when they're not always about war. When you kind of get the little glimpses into different alien cultures that the author has created. I love Star Trek, and I love the exciting episodes, but I also love the calmer episodes, which are usually not as popular because not a lot happens. And I like that. I want to get more into the characters and feel the relationships of how the crew comes together and forms bonds. So I am enjoying that one. I've been craving some space opera, but it's hard to find one that's not really focused on war, and this one is lighthearted. Surely there's some scary things that happen, and there is an overall war in the background, but it's not about the war. Okay, hoping to read next week. I'm continuing with my reading rush goals. So I have described these books in a little bit more detail in my Reading Rush TBR video, which I will put a link to in the description. But briefly, here's what I'm planning to read, one a day in the next 7 days, so before next Friday reads. Castle Rackrent by Maria Edgeworth. This is an 18th century book about the different generations in the Irish family called the Rackrents. Sounds really kind of funny, interesting. I'm enjoying the 18th century literature that I've been reading lately. I'm also planning to read E.M. Forster's Where Angels Fear to Tread. This is the story of a man traveling to Italy from England to save his brother's widow from what he feels is an ill-matched romance. And, of course, things escalate from there. So I have enjoyed the E.M. Forsters that I have read and look forward to adding this to my read list. Then I'm reading Charles Dickens' The Haunted House. This is a series of short stories that are all about ghosts in a house. And they are written by different authors. Charles Dickens is the collector. He's the editor of this collection. But he wrote a few of the stories. Other authors include Elizabeth Gaskell and Wilkie Collins, Hesba Stretton, which I've never heard of, George Augustus Sala, which I've never heard of, and Adelaide Ann Proctor, another Victorian writer I've never heard of. So I'm looking forward to kind of experiencing some familiar faces, but also new ones. And a little bit more scary story, right? I'm also planning to read Edith Wharton's Ethan Frome. This is the story of a man dealing with the bleakness of his life and of his love, and kind of the good choices and bad choices that I imagine he's going to make. I'm also trying to read Henry James's The Aspern Papers. This is the story of a man and his obsessive quest to obtain the personal papers of a deceased poet that he loved. It's a little bit about passion, a little bit about poetry and collection, book collecting. Oh, I'm really excited for that one. I'm also excited for Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling. This is another 18th century novel about a man who is very sweet and very gentle, living in a world that is really kind and really rough with him. So this should pair really well with Candide by Voltaire, which I'm also reading, which is another 18th century French book. And this is about, it's a satire on optimistic people, which sounds like the Man of Feeling might be an optimistic person. He certainly is he is the victim of what's happening in this book in many ways. So I'm going to read these together, not together, but read them side by side and do a little bit of comparison. Should be interesting. So that is what I have finished, what I'm currently reading, and what I'm planning to read next week. What are you reading? Have you read anything that I mentioned in today's video? What did you think? Did you have any similar reactions to the books that I've read? Have you tried Richard Matheson? I'm really interested in kind of reading more from him. Let me know in the comments. And remember, there's always another book.